Hi, welcome back. I'm here with Joseph K. Dogovich, aka Joe Doggy, aka Stubby Toe Joe. And he apparently wants to help me talk about our last group of fallacies. So, recall that we spent some time talking about a bunch of fallacies that fall under the classification fallacies of relevance. Then we talked about fallacies of unwarranted assumption. And now we're going to finish up our study of informal fallacies by talking about fallacies of ambiguity or diversion. Um, I think that it's important to reiterate a point that I made early on, and that is that what is more important than you being able to classify a fallacy or label a piece of reasoning as a straw man or an ad hominem or a question begging argument, it is for you to be able to reconstitute the reasoning, and then be able to articulate succinctly and clearly what has gone wrong with that reasoning. So, effectively, let's say what makes this piece of reasoning an instance of ad hominem or an instance of false cause, and then why reasoning that way is problematic. So, the more that you can articulate what the problem is and why it's a problem, how the reasoning fails, and why we shouldn't reason that way, the better things are for us, both in terms of our understanding and how we then interact with other people in terms of talking about fallacies. So rather than just say to somebody, oh, you've just committed red herring, which won't be very impressive to them, you can explain to them what the problem is and why it's a problem. So, as a reminder, we've covered fallacies of relevance and fallacies of unwarranted assumption. We're finishing up with fallacies of ambiguity or diversion. We have looked at fallacies that appear in our ordinary daily lives, insofar as we've looked at examples from the world of advertising, the world of politics, and elsewhere. So we should be pretty good at this point at recognizing fallacies in ordinary language, but we're going to keep practicing with that section as we finish up. So let's go ahead and take a look at the list of fallacies of ambiguity or diversion. So, fallacies of ambiguity occur when there is a linguistic error made in the reasoning. And fallacies of diversion occur when the arguer diverts attention from the issue at hand in a particular way. So, for fallacies of ambiguity, we have equivocation, amphiboly, composition, and division. And for fallacies of diversion, we have two fallacies of emphasis, straw man and red herring. And we'll talk about what a fallacy of emphasis is. Equivocation and amphiboly both involve specific linguistic shifts that generate an erroneous inference. So when we have word ambiguity, we have, in the case of equivocation, the repeated use of a word, but each usage has a different meaning. And so you get a word that can be, because it can be taken in more than one sense, leads the person who hears or reads the argument in one direction, and then the shift to another meaning of the same word brings about an erroneous inference. The problem, of course, is that because the word remains the same, if the shift is subtle enough, someone who is listening to or reading the argument won't detect that shift, and so will be led to the erroneous inference. With amphiboly, we have a word ambiguity insofar as it's typically the case that a misplaced modifier means that the sentence's meaning in which that misplaced modifier occurs could be the sentence's meaning could be taken in more than one way, and so an erroneous inference can occur. So, and another way in which we can think about amphiboly has to do with the grammatical structure of a sentence with respect to punctuation. So, I'm going to give you some visuals of what I'm talking about when I talk about the shift in the meaning of a word. So, you have two versions of one image, and that's not where the shift is that I'm talking about. I'm just giving you two versions of the same duck rabbit. On the left is a sketch, and on the right is a little bit more of a detailed rendering. And what you're supposed to do is see either the duck or the rabbit, but then shift your perception so that you see the other creature. So let's say you see the duck at the beginning, you should be able to make a perceptual shift and see the rabbit, or vice versa. It's also the same thing with the old young woman. Depending on which version you are looking at, you've got a detailed drawing on the left or more of a sketch on the right. In either case, though, you are first confronted with the old woman or the young woman. It depends on what you perceive first. But if you force your perspective to shift, you will perceive the other. So take a look at each and see if you can shift back and forth between the old and the young woman in each of the renderings. Here, again, you have a shift. You have either two faces in profile facing each other, or you have, if you focus on the white middle, you have a vase. So two faces in profile or a vase or two faces in profile. Now let's take this idea of a perspective shift and a perception change to the realm of language. Someone said to the American critic, poet, and short story writer Dorothy Parker, quote, "I can't bear fools," meaning I can't put up with fools. Parker replied, quote, "Your mother could give birth to them." Now, what Parker did was take the word bear, which was intended to mean, as I said, put up with, and she shifted the meaning of the word to make a joke, and the shift from put up with to give birth to or carry was made. Second example, as far as I'm concerned, we need pay no attention to the president of the college when it comes to educational matters because he has no authority in education. He doesn't even have enough authority to prevent students from staging protest rallies. Now, in this example, you have an obvious case of equivocation, and what I mean by that is this. The word authority is repeated, right? He has no authority in education. He doesn't even have enough authority to prevent students from staging protest rallies. There's a shift from the meaning of authority in the first instance to the meaning of authority in the second. In the first instance, authority seems to mean something like knowledge or learned experience, or authority as in isn't an educator. And in the second instance, authority means power. Another silly example from Ellen DeGeneres goes like this. Change is good. Nickels, dimes, and quarters are always helpful. The first sentence, change is good, would be said in the context of Alterations, right? Change in life, doing things differently. Change in your life is good. But then there's the shift to change as in coins. And then from the movie Office Space, Bob says, "Looks like you've been missing a lot of work lately." And Peter replies, "Well, I wouldn't exactly say I've been missing it, Bob." We have missing taken in two different ways. Bob uses missing in the sense of being absent from work, and Peter cleverly responds, missing as in longing for it or being separated from it and not liking that separation. A cartoon, you have a couple flies on a screen door. You have a fly corpse on the front porch or the landing, and the caption reads as follows. One fly says to the other, "He will be greatly missed both on and off the screen." And the joke there is we can take screen in two different senses, screen as in the screen door and screen as in the movie screen. We also have another fabulous Gary Larson cartoon, The Far Side. And a painter is hard at work on another masterpiece. Apparently the painter is a master, but the dog says, "So where's my dinner? One of the great masters indeed." Where because the man is painting, we think of a master painter. But the dog is thinking of master as in owner. Here are some amphiboly examples, and what I've given to you is not just the example, but also the inferences one could draw based on the flawed sentence structure or misplaced modifier. Well, granted, a misplaced modifier is an error in structure, but I was thinking of error in structure in terms of punctuation and error in structure in terms of the misplaced modifier. "I can't say too many good things about her, therefore you don't like her," or "therefore you like her a lot." Now, it could be the case that you could say that this first example is more a case of accent or emphasis, where depending on how you emphasize the words, depending on how you intone, you get two different meanings. Second example, "He ate the cookies on the couch, therefore he picked up the cookies that were on the couch." "He ate the cookies on the couch, therefore he sat on the couch while eating cookies." For those of you who have children and don't know it, we have a nursery downstairs. Therefore, you'd better figure out whether or not you have kids. Therefore, you can let your kids play in the nursery. "I'll give you the house or the car and the cottage. Therefore, I'll take the house and the cottage. Therefore, I'll take the car and the cottage." Ask yourself whether or not there's still another inference that you could draw based on the fact that missing punctuation leaves it unclear what the person is saying that they will give you. And then lastly, "I saw the game at the bar, therefore the game was played at the bar, therefore the game was viewed at the bar." And then the cartoon, "Meeting tonight, how to get money out of politics." It's either a campaign reform rally or a lobbyist's workshop. Next, let's move on to one of two related fallacies, composition, the other division. In composition, the conclusion of an argument depends on an unjustified transference of the parts of something onto the whole. When a property belongs to all the members of a class, it is thought to apply to the class itself. So the problem is that each and every member of the class, because it has some property A, is said to have that property transfer to the class as a whole. before we move on to some examples, let's distinguish the fallacy of composition from the fallacy of hasty generalization. The latter fallacy, hasty generalization, moves from individuals and small samples to the entirety of a class, that is, from individuals to classes. Composition, on the other hand, moves from properties of individuals to the class itself being or possessing that property. So remember, some of our examples are meant to be really straightforward and obvious. They're made up examples so that the error is clear. But you will, as we've seen already and will continue to see with examples from our daily lives, that fallacies are not always so obvious. Anyway, moving on, here are some examples. Each atom in the table is invisible to the naked eye, therefore the table is invisible. Selfishly pursuing only one's own desires is the best way for the individual to achieve what they want. Therefore, selfish pursuit of each individual's desires is the best way to achieve what the society wants. So in the second example, we have a move that's just a smidge more subtle. We're talking about a property, in this case, desires, moving from the individual to the class as a whole, in this case, society. Division is the reverse of composition. In other words, the conclusion of an argument in division depends on the erroneous transfer of an attribute from the whole onto its parts. So what we say is that since the group or the class has some property A, it follows that the individual members of the group or class has that same property. And this also applies to objects. And what I mean by that is, you could say, for example, that since the cake is sweet, each of its ingredients, including the salt, is sweet. So the problem is that the reasoner doesn't properly transfer the concept that's at issue from the whole to the part. And if you take a look at Baronett's bald eagle example, you'll see this as an illustration of the failure as it applies to groups. And forgive the lack of a closed parenthesis there. I'll have to add that next time. Here are some examples. This perfume smells great, therefore each of the ingredients in the perfume will smell great. This team was able to beat the #1 ranked school in the country, therefore any one of the players would be able to beat any team in the country. This is a cartoon that is terrific because it clearly articulates both composition and division fallacies by way of example, but also by way of explanation. There are really great cartoons using the extra normal program. At least I think it's a program, but it's no longer available, which is too bad. Anyway, what you were able to do was to voice from a script whatever it was that you wanted your characters to say. You could put your characters in different environments, use different characters, have different voices that would speak your lines, but sadly it's no longer available. Anyway, take a listen to a really good example of an explanation of each of these fallacies.
Professor Appenstall, I wanted to say something in the class, but the bell rang.
Yes, what is it, my dear?
Well, in your lecture you were talking about quality of education. But it seems to me that if someone went to one of the Ivy Leagues like Harvard or Princeton, that they would be well educated.
And why would that be necessarily so, my dear?
Because the people who get into places like Harvard or Princeton are the brightest and smartest people in their class. Ivy Leagues only accept the best students, and their acceptance rate is very low. So it would make sense that these schools would be the places where you could get the best education.
My dear girl, what you are saying may or may not be the case, but it is most assuredly not for the reasons you present. You are evidencing two errors in reasoning. The first is that of division or whole to part, where you are saying what is true of a whole must be also true of its parts. In this case, you are saying that because highly regarded universities, such as Harvard or Princeton, are considered world-class universities in terms of their educational quality, that indubitably the students that attend these universities must likewise be well educated. Your second error in reasoning is called composition or part to whole, which is a logical fallacy which says that what is true of its parts is undeniably true of its whole. Even though it is true that these universities generally admit the brightest students, these students may or may not avail themselves of their innate intelligence. These Ivy League schools have not earned their reputation just because their students are some of the best and brightest.
So think about the movement that is explained here. We're talking about the quality of the institution and transferring that quality onto individual students, and taking individual students and a quality of them and transferring that onto the institution as a whole. Our last two fallacies, straw man and red herring, are fallacies of diversion. And they are arguably two of the most common fallacies that you will see in your daily lives. The straw man fallacy is going to feel a little bit like an ad hominem, but I'm going to make a distinction that I hope will help you see that straw man and ad hominem are not the same fallacy. So the straw man argument proceeds this way. Person A has a position. Person B misrepresents that position in some way, typically distorts it such that the position of person A looks really bad. And then person B dismisses person A's position because it's so bad and acts as if the position that he or she holds, that is, that person B holds, is therefore the better position. So the problem is that actually there are two problems. One is that person B is distorting person A's position or argument. So you don't win an argument by misrepresenting the opposing side. And then the second problem is that person B hasn't actually overcome person A's argument or position with a better argument. So the basic problem that you find with the straw man is that the original position, person A's position, because it hasn't been accurately represented, it has not in fact been refuted. But that's what person B claims to have done, namely refute person A's argument. Now, notice the difference between straw man and ad hominem. Straw man involves distorting, misrepresenting a position and then discarding it as being bad. Ad hominem involves ignoring someone's argument, attacking the person who presented that argument, and dismissing the argument along with the person. So in straw man, we don't actually have any attack on the person. Instead, the focus is exclusively on the argument. That is, there is a misrepresentation of the argument, which is then dismissed. Let's go ahead and look at a really nice articulation of the straw man fallacy along with some examples.
The straw man fallacy. Contrary to what many people would have us believe, a straw man is not simply an argument that you dislike or find inconvenient. Rather, it is a version of an argument that is misrepresented, simplified, so that it is easier to knock over. Just as an actual man made of straw is a less solid version of a man made of flesh, a straw man argument is a less solid version of a fully fleshed out argument. A straw man replaces or represents whatever actual argument is being made. Straw manning can come in many different different forms. It's not even always intentional. You might accidentally construct a straw man if you don't fully understand the depth of an argument. And that is fine. It happens to the best of us. However, to intentionally misread or misrepresent an argument to simplify the process of discrediting it, that's a little bit less forgivable. To take nuanced points out of context, to ignore crucial information, to even exaggerate claims to the point of absurdity, which is then easier to refute. These are all straw man tactics. For example, Mike and Straw Mike are having a conversation about how to responsibly depict awful stuff in media. I don't think it's too much to ask that when a media creator wants to show heinous or awful stuff, they do so in a context that shows that that stuff is heinous and awful. Oh, so now we're not allowed to show violent or terrible things unless we include some long-winded sermon about how bad things are bad? I think creators should be able to show or do whatever they want. The original argument states a preference for what Mike thinks constitutes the responsible use of media. The straw man argument recasts this as something much simpler and easier to agree with. Freedom is good, censorship is bad. But now Mike and Straw Mike are no longer arguing about the same point, and so the conversation will quickly become unfocused and aggressive, which is never fun. If you're gonna win an argument, you want to win against what the other side actually thinks, don't you? A straw man argument keeps that from happening.
Here is an example that is obvious, I hope, from a 2012 Rock the Vote public service announcement featuring characters from the shows American Dad and Family Guy, where capitalizing on and sort of poking fun at bad reasoning is par for the course. So Stan Smith from American Dad says, "Make your voice heard, even if it's a whining, sanctimonious liberal voice trying to get illegal immigrants free hair gel and heroin." Brian Griffin from Family Guy responds, "Or if you're a trigger-happy conservative, weasel-faced hate spigot." So what we have is the following. Each of these characters is trying to effectively misrepresent what it means to make your voice heard, which is not exactly what we want to do when we say get out the vote. So notice what each of these characters is doing. The Stan Smith character is egregiously misrepresenting the liberal position on various matters, and the Brian Griffin character is egregiously misrepresenting the conservative position on a number of matters. So, yes, are these examples really obvious? Of course. But it gives you an idea of what you should be looking for when you come across more subtle examples. But we're not going to get to a subtle example just yet. The next one comes from an episode of The Colbert Report.
Let's talk about your opponent, Sue Kelly, for a second.
Okay, sure.
Besides the economy, reproductive rights, taxation, the environment, and education, where do you and Sue Kelly differ?
Well, she's voted for this war, which I would not have voted for. She voted for...
So you'd rather see Saddam back in power?
So we should be able to see that when one person says that they were not in favor of the Iraq War, that is not equivalent to saying that they want to see Saddam Hussein retain power or wanted to see Saddam Hussein retain power. But that exchange is exactly what you got. The individual whom Stephen Colbert interviews says that he was not in favor of the Iraq War, and Stephen Colbert's representation is a complete exaggeration of the position, which is to say, he said, you want to see Saddam in power. And like I said, the two are not equivalent. Let's take a look at another example of explaining what a straw man argument does.
Okay, let's say that you're defending chocolate and I'm defending vanilla. Now, if I were to say to you, vanilla is the best flavor ice cream, you'd say,
no, chocolate is.
exactly, but you can't win that argument. So, I'll ask you, so you think chocolate is the end-all and be-all of ice cream, do you?
It's the best ice cream. I wouldn't order any of it.
Oh, so it's all chocolate for you, is it?
Yes, chocolate is all I need.
Well, I need more than chocolate. And for that matter, I need more than vanilla. I believe that we need freedom and choice when it comes to our ice cream, and that, Joy Naylor, that is the definition of liberty.
But that's not what we're talking about.
Ah, but that's what I'm talking about.
But you didn't prove that vanilla's the best.
I didn't have to. I proved that you're wrong. And if you're wrong, I'm right.
But you still didn't convince me.
It's that I'm not after you. I'm after them.
There are several great things about this clip. I'll start with the last first, where the father says that his goal is not to demonstrate that his son's position is wrong or even that his own position is right. It's that he's trying to win over the audience to his side, whatever it might be. So the other important point that was made was that rather than stay focused on the issue, which is attempting to prove that vanilla ice cream or vanilla flavor is better than chocolate, the person who holds the the person who holds the chocolate view is told that what he's really doing is holding a position that's against liberty and freedom and happiness and all of that, when that has nothing to do with whether or not chocolate is the better flavor or vanilla is the better flavor. So try and take another look at this clip when you get a chance, because it's worth looking at more than once. Now we have a commercial in which Time Warner Cable is committing the straw man fallacy against DirecTV. Recall earlier we had a DirecTV commercial that fallaciously attempted to show that DirecTV is better than cable, implicitly Time Warner Cable, I think. So let's take a look at this and then analyze it.
Here's something DirecTV won't tell you. They hate puppies. Fact. They charge you every month for HD service. Fact. Time Warner Cable HD is free. Saves you what could be hundreds of dollars. Fact. You can spend those hundreds of dollars on like a mountain of dog food. Fact. Puppies love dog food. Therefore, DirecTV hates puppies. Who hates puppies?
Free HD, DirecTV.
So I think there's more going on in this commercial than just the straw man fallacy that I'm going to articulate. However, since we're focusing on straw man, we'll pay attention to that. But don't forget, it's typically the case that bad reasoning is not obviously just one version of bad reasoning. It's oftentimes several ways in which, or several instances of bad reasoning wrapped up in one. Okay, so here's the way that I've interpreted this commercial based on the premises. We have the following: DirecTV charges you for HD. The money you spend on HD with DirecTV prevents you from spending money on dog food. Therefore, DirecTV hates puppies. So the problem here is that it's a misrepresentation of the DirecTV position to say that they're charging you for HD will prevent you from buying dog food. Their position is just that this is what they charge. There's more going on here, since it's the case that Time Warner doesn't charge you for HD. Time Warner loves puppies, and therefore you should be a Time Warner customer. So it doesn't follow that DirecTV hates puppies or that Time Warner loves puppies, given the evidence. Moreover, the evidence that is in play, charging or not charging for HD, is distorted or misrepresented or by bringing the dog issue into play. Our last fallacy, red herring, involves classic misdirection. It's something like a magic trick insofar as it diverts the attention of the listener or reader away from the real issue of the argument at hand, and then asserts a conclusion as if it was drawn from those very premises. In fact, however, the conclusion is drawn from the diversion premises. So it works basically like this. Some claim X has a deceptive resemblance to Y. Y and Z, on the other hand, are generally related. Therefore, X and Z are related. The reasoning fails because what we want is for our premise and conclusion to be related to each other directly and authentically, rather than have those premises be connected to another premise or set of premises that really are not relevant to the conclusion but distance you or lead you astray. So the reason why the red herring fallacy is called red herring is because of a training technique that hunters use or used, whereby dogs would follow a scent that a red herring was meant to distract them from. So they'd be galloping along following a scent. A red herring scent was laid across that path and goes in another direction. And if the dog is distracted by the red herring, it'll follow the red herring and be led off the path of the original scent. And as far as premises go, that's effectively what happens. Premises are taking you in one direction, and then there is a shift to another set of premises that lead you to a conclusion that you would not otherwise have chosen. Let's take a look at some examples. Take a read. We've got two adorable little ducklings. The first duckling on the left says, "It is my contention that the flying spaghetti monster does exist." The duckling on the right, in response to the duckling on the left saying, "It is my contention that the flying spaghetti monster exists," says, "What evidence do you have to support such an assertion?" And the duckling on the left says, "Oh, there's plenty of evidence. It's all around us. Besides, look how I'm sitting on one leg." Here's another example. It's an exchange. Senator Clark says the following: "Why are you not willing to support the anti-abortion amendment? Don't you have any feelings at all for the unborn children whose lives are being indiscriminately blotted out?" Senator Rich responds, "I just don't understand why you people who get so worked up about lives being blotted out by abortion don't have the same feelings about the thousands of lives that are blotted out every year by the indiscriminate use of handguns. Is not the issue of the sanctity of human life involved in both issues? Why have you not supported us in our efforts at gun control legislation?" So obviously both senators are making errors, but the strictly speaking, the red herring error is made by Senator Rich, who makes a connection between anti-abortion and gun control. And here is an example from a movie. Here we've got an obvious example.
How would you bring jobs back to the 14th district? That's a great question, Carl. Thank you for asking it. It's the first thing I think of when I wake up in the morning, and it's the last thing I think of when I go to bed. Jobs in North Carolina mean what? A strong North Carolina, and a strong North Carolina means a strong America, and that, my friends, is how we're going to do it.
So there's a tactic that politicians often use when asked a question that they don't want to answer for whatever reason. They say, "Thanks for asking that question," which makes you think that they're going to lay out a policy in response to it or mount some sort of argument that stakes out their position. But instead, what they do is make some rather vague comment that is only very tenuously related conceptually to the original question. Let's continue this time with an example from the 2008 presidential campaign, in which a commercial by now President Obama's campaign released against Senator McCain. And let's pay particular attention to seeing where the commercial starts. In other words, what the initial problem seems to be, and then where the commercial ends with respect to Senator McCain's position on the economy.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Maybe you're struggling just to pay the mortgage on your home. But recently, John McCain said the fundamentals of our economy are strong. Then again, that same day, when asked how many houses he owns, McCain lost track. He couldn't remember. Well, it's 7. 7 houses. And here's one house America can't afford to let John McCain move into.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Maybe you're struggling just to pay the mortgage on your home. But recently, John McCain said the fundamentals of our economy are strong. Then again, that same day, when asked how many houses he owns, McCain lost track. He couldn't remember. Well, it's 7. 7 houses. And here's one house America can't afford to let John McCain move into.
So the problem is that we begin with a difficulty in the economy. People are having trouble affording mortgages. And if you recall, this was a period of really difficult financial hardships or difficult times. There were a lot of financial hardships for very many people, especially the so-called middle class and the poor. And the commercial moves from that to John McCain not knowing how many homes he owns. And there's a sort of tenuous connection between people struggling with being able to make their mortgage payments or their rents or whatever, and John McCain being so rich that he can't even keep track of how many homes he owns. You know, he's out of touch with Americans, blah, blah, blah. But of course, that's not relevant to, or that's not where we started with the commercial. The commercial is people are having trouble making mortgage payments, but John McCain thinks the economy is strong. So where the argument should have gone with is some sort of critique of the claim that the economy is strong, not a transition to talking about John McCain owning lots of houses but not knowing how many homes he owns and how much they're worth. Let's move on to another example, this time on the conservative side of the political party spectrum, where we have Anderson Cooper interviewing Michelle Bachmann.
Republican Paul Ryan has suggested sharp cuts in Medicare and Social Security. Are you willing to make cuts there?
Well, I think we know that just within a day or so, the President of the United States will be taking a trip over to India that is expected to cost the taxpayers $200 million a day. He's taking 2,000 people with him. He'll be renting out over 870 rooms in India, and these are 5-star hotel rooms at the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel. This is the kind of over-the-top.
Republican Paul Ryan has suggested sharp cuts in Medicare and Social Security. Are you willing to make cuts there?
What I did was I played the clip through for you, and then I played the opening question again. Notice that the question has to do with whether or not Michelle Bachmann would be willing to make certain cuts, similarly to Paul Ryan's proposed cuts, and she diverts attention away from that question to what money President Obama is spending. So you'll notice perhaps a bit of what looks to be like a missing the point or an ad hominem, but notice that she may be trying to get the audience to think about critique or making a critique of the Obama administration. But what she's doing is diverting attention away from the issue at hand, which has to do with what sort of financial reductions she would make in certain services. All right, I can't go too long without a Gary Larson cartoon, a Far Side cartoon. Here we have a classic case of misdirection, which is the passenger who is letting his dog drive and who says, "Hey, I'm not crazy. Sure, I let him drive once in a while, but he's never off his leash even for a second." So depending on how you interpret this, you might get a combo missing the point and then red herring fallacy. But I think the red herring is really obvious insofar as he accepts that there is this issue of the dog driving the car, but then misdirects the attention away from that fact by talking about how the dog's always on a leash, which is, we would think, a good thing, just not under these circumstances. Okay, so in my view, the most important section of the chapter is D, that is recognizing fallacies in ordinary language. And we've been doing this a bit. We've looked at examples of bad reasoning that are not always explicit in there being a red herring or a straw man or an ad hominem or a slippery slope, whatever it might be. So, what you want to make sure that you do, as we've talked about before, is three things. Lay out the reasoning in the given fallacy. Make sure that if there are two positions staked out, that each is clearly represented. Then describe the most obvious way in which the reasoning fails. You could also describe other related fallacies in terms of the mechanical failure, if you will, of the reasoning. And then you can talk about why reasoning in this way or these ways is not a good thing. So what's more important to me than labeling a piece of reasoning as this or that fallacy is to be able to articulate what's gone wrong and why it's problematic, and make sure before you do those two things that you understand the reasoning very clearly to begin with. So lay out premises and conclusion first. We've just done a lot of work. We've covered a lot of fallacies, and both in section C as well as previously in sections A and B. We're now done with our discussion of informal fallacies. Remember, what you want to be able to do, in my view, more than labeling a fallacy or classifying a fallacy, that is naming an instance of bad reasoning as this or that fallacy, or putting it under a classification like a fallacy of unwarranted assumption, is for you to be able to do the following. Represent as clearly as you can the reasoning that's gone bad. If the reasoning that's gone bad includes somebody else's reasoning, like person A has mounted an argument and person B is supposed to respond to that argument, but they don't, and that's where the fallacy occurs, represent both pieces of reasoning as clearly as you can. Then discuss, and it doesn't have to be a long discussion, sometimes it can be one or two fairly brief sentences, how it is that the argument has failed. What's the breakdown? Where is the problem with the reasoning? So you're going to explain, identify and explain that problem. And then lastly, again, briefly, concisely, clearly, you're going to articulate why this reasoning is problematic. So what you're doing is you're continuously carving out the territory indirectly of what counts as good inductive reasoning by honing in on what's gone wrong. So remember, good reasoning is going to involve premises that are relevant to the conclusion, or conclusion that's relevant to its premises. The reasoning is going to focus on the facts, or at least on ideas that people accept as true for the purpose of moving forward. And there is going to be an aim at truth, not at manipulation or distortion or trying to undermine another person in their position. So practice, 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 and we will engage in some practice together. I'll make a video in which I look at some fallacies and discuss them with you, and show you how I might approach writing out the elements that I discussed, representing the argument, articulating what the problem is, and then why that reasoning is problematic. All right, so let's keep practicing.